This is lecture number 15, Slavery in Antebellum America between 1794 and 1860. Antebellum really means the period before the American Civil War. We talked before about how the plantation economy of the South just kind of moved from large-scale tobacco cultivation between the 1600s and 1700s, and how it moved from tobacco to cotton production. That would be, a name or a reference to the South, King Cotton. And it was, remember, because of Eli Whitney's cotton gin that the South would turn to producing this in their plantations to feed the textile industry. The South produced 75% of the world's cotton. So they relied on primarily cotton production and nothing else. This is going to hurt them. They did not have a lot of diversity in their ways of making money. Everything was invested in cotton production. And with that, the investment of slavery. You can argue, because this lecture is really all about cotton production and the institutional slavery and how it affected the South. You can say in many ways that the South was broken up into three regions, and the map right here kind of describes it. There was a border South. While it was technically the South, it bordered the North, and it had fewer plantations and fewer slaves as it bordered the North. And actually, the border South, for the most part, would stay with the Union during the Civil War. They wouldn't secede. They had to weigh the benefits of joining the South or joining the North, and they stayed with the North. As you went to the Middle South, you would see more of the institutional slavery and plantations, and the Lower South, South Carolina, Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. These would be the ones that would heavily invest in cotton, and this is where you would see the larger scale plantations. And the Lower South would have the wealthiest and those with the most political power. Another term to describe the impact of cotton on the South, the whole institution of slavery, society, it was called a peculiar institution. Because it was like nowhere else in the world. It was very peculiar. This whole concept of a small percentage of the population, planters, growers with a whole lot of wealth. It wasn't a large part of the population that owned such elaborate plantation homes. And they had their own upper echelon society. If you look at the picture over here to the right, kind of aristocrats, aristocrats in America, this planter aristocracy that took place. And they looked down on everyone else. They looked down on poor whites. Of course, they opposed everything in the North, referring to them as Yankees. And again, everything was dedicated to the plantation system. Because the South relied so much on slavery, Europeans, for the most part, did not immigrate to the South because there were no lower level economic opportunities like there were in the North in the factories. When we talk about plantation slavery, we talked already a little bit about slavery, the cruelty, the evil of slavery, the worst dark mark in American history, from the Middle Passage to the slave ships to the auctioning of slaves throughout the South, the way their culture, they attempted to steal their culture, and again, enslavement was evil in so many ways. But in spite of that, a type of slave culture emerged or developed. Many of them, because of their masters, did engage in Christianity. They followed or began to worship Christ, and they married, they had children and communities, knowing at any time it could be broken. Dance and music, blending of languages took place through different slave communities in the South. Now, all along institutional slavery, there were revolts, there was resistance. There were those that purposely slowed down work, even poisoned masters, or broke tools. In the first major slave revolt took place in 1739, Stono Rebellion. It took place in South Carolina, trying to make it to Florida, that was owned by Spain at the time, and to try to escape. There was the revolt of Gabriel Prosser in 1800, a slave blacksmith in Virginia that actually tried to plan a military slave revolt. Unfortunately, it never came about, and he and others that tried to join him were executed. Denmark Vesey, 1822. He was actually a mulatto in Charleston, North Carolina. He actually planned a slave revolt as well. But even within the slaves, he was actually a slave that knew what he was up to, told a master, told the slave owner about the plot, and he was also executed. The one that probably had the biggest impact, however, was Nat Turner's revolt in 1831, because there was mass-scale killings in this one. 60 Virginians were slaughtered, including women and children. It was a mass-scale revolt against the owners and their families, or slave revolts in a certain section of Virginia. Over 100 slaves were killed in response, and Turner himself was executed. They hung him. But Nat Turner's revolt really caused a paranoia among Southern owners, and they would do anything to try to stop such future events. And it led to really tough laws on the slaves themselves. And of course, they feared that the North would only incite revolts like Nat Turner's. Now, in the South, again, I refer to the upper elite plantation owners. This is important. The white majority during this time. Let's take a look at that. 75% of white Southerners owned no slaves at all. None. And there was another bulk that might have owned a few. The plantation owners owned the most slaves. The common white man, and usually a subsistence farmer, a man that just was barely getting by. And this question always comes out, leading up to the Civil War. If a great majority of them owned no slaves at all, why were they fighting for the institution? Well, even though they owned no slaves, a lot of them wanted to own slaves. A lot of them had hopes of that economic opportunity of owning their own plantation and plotting land with slaves. So they were defending that dream, so to speak. Now, a threat to slavery, and of course all of this peculiar institution, was the growth of abolitionism. I told you how that was part of the Reform movement and the Second Great Awakening. We talked about William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, important abolitionists. Well, another important abolitionist is this lady right here to the right, but I put it in this area because, again, it was a more direct threat to slavery, were the actions of Harriet Tubman. A very posing threat to this slave system. Harriet Tubman was known as the most important conductor of the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad was an organized system. Abolitionists used this organized system to help slaves escape, to help them escape all the way to Canada, because Canada was a free society. They wouldn't even help them just escape to the North, because federally, according to federal law, the South can acquire their slaves back. So it was a system to help them escape all the way to the North. So this was definitely something that made the Southerners very upset. And as the spirit of abolitionism grows in the mid 1800s, from the early 1800s to the mid 1800s, especially the North and the Second Great Awakening and political leaders began to question the institution of slavery. The Southern response to abolitionism, they defended it as their way of life. They argued that slavery was in the Bible, and they also called Northerners hypocrites. The South said that Northerners were using slavery as well for economic prosperity. Look at this picture at the bottom. The Northerners had these immigrants in terrible conditions working in the factories. The South referred to them as Northern wage slaves. So again, don't preach to us about the morality of slavery when you are engaged in it for your economic gain. Even in the early 1800s, slavery was a hot topic, so much so that enough congressmen in favor of slavery passed a gag resolution in 1836. This gag resolution in 1836 was a resolution that forbid the discussion of slavery on the floor of Congress. So, and this would not last forever, but it was an attempt to quiet the argument or the debate concerning slavery in Congress. There was enough that supported slavery at the time, North and South, that they passed this gag resolution. But of course, it's not going to go away. So the big theme here is just one, this impact of cotton production on America, especially the South. 75% of the world's cotton. And a lot of it went to England, which the South thought would help them if they ever went to war against the North. Didn't happen because we sold so much to them. The impact of cotton production and slavery on the South politically, economically, and socially. Who had the political power because of it, who benefited the most, and what did society look like? The common white farmer, for example, they were looked down upon and even discriminated by the wealthy as well.